Hello, and welcome to today's presentation called Finesse Your Slide, Tips and Tricks for Your Grad Slam Slide. This webinar will take you through the strategies for using your one optional PowerPoint slide for Grad Slam. Before we start, let's take some time to think about whether you have sat through a really long PowerPoint presentation and didn't remember anything, or whether you have given a really long PowerPoint presentation and wondered if anyone remembered anything. Chances are you've been in both situations. You've given and have been subjected to long PowerPoint presentations and likely remembered a fraction of what was presented. Our goal today is to identify some tactics you can employ to ensure your audience is engaged. I want us to move through this workshop with the following in mind. People will forget most of the info you give them, but you can choose what they remember with a visual aid. Now I put an asterisk there because not everything can be made sticky with visual aids. Sometimes folks remember clever, moving openings, stories, or even a really great example. But for our purposes today, we're going to talk about how visual aids in a PowerPoint slide can be used effectively in your presentation. So in this workshop, I will be posing some questions that will help you prepare your recorded talks for Grad Slam, and questions for you to consider when presenting with a PowerPoint. These questions will help you decide how to best use a slide to augment and complement your talk. Along the way, we will look at examples from former Grad Slam participants, but keep in mind that the ones I'm going to be showing are not objectively the best slides. Rather, I want you to look at a number of examples so you can take inspiration from them. Perhaps you might even come away from this webinar deciding that you don't need a slide for Grad Slam at all. And so we begin with our first question, a very important one before you even open a PowerPoint. What is the purpose of your slide? Ask yourself, will my slide illustrate a key point, demonstrate examples, emphasize a central idea, or evoke strong feelings or impressions? And I want you to ask yourself these questions because the answer could very well be that you won't need a slide for any of these purposes and you actually don't need to create one. And remember that for the competition, there are no points awarded for visuals. That means you will not be evaluated or scored based on your use of visuals. So if you feel like the slide is not going to be crucial to your talk, feel free to not use one. However, if you do decide to use it, let's talk about some principles and some questions you might want to think about. Our ultimate goal when designing a PowerPoint slide should be to balance information with attention. And this is because your PowerPoint slide should really augment and complement your talk. Remember that you are the presentation. So let's say you've pondered on this and you will use a slide. What should you do now? You have two options on how you want to approach your use of slide. You can either ignore your slide or reference it. I give you these two options because it will determine how you are going to deploy visual elements in your talk. Ignoring your slide means you are using the image or images as a backdrop. One goal you might achieve by using this approach is to take your audience on a journey verbally primarily and visually maybe. By that I mean that the visual isn't really playing a significant part here, but rather reinforcing a feeling or idea, like in these two examples, but the focus is on the talk itself. When using this approach, the image should speak clearly to the audience since you will not be providing the context around it. The image should be clear and focused, which means it's of good quality and easily accessible. For using this approach, I recommend using a representative image because it will communicate much more clearly and quickly if the image refers to something we can all easily define. Unless, of course, abstraction is the point of your talk. The referenced approach requires you to directly engage with the images and text you provide in your slide. To do this effectively, you'll want to choose a 15 to 30 second section or window to draw the audience's attention to the slide. When you're using this approach, be specific and direct, but also it's best to plan the moment to create effect, when to highlight, and how to draw back the audience to your speaking. Some motivations for using the referenced approach are when the images help to explain complex ideas or to visually summarize key project elements. So that's the first set of considerations to make before you even create a PowerPoint slide. Make sure that your slide is augmenting and complementing your talk. Decide on your approach, whether you will ignore it or reference it, and making sure that you don't rely on your slide to convey your entire message. So once you've made these initial decisions as to the purpose and approach of your PowerPoint slide, you'd want to consider a design strategy. So now we're going to talk about different ways that you can utilize and even maximize the space of the 16:9 PowerPoint slide. Consider these 3 design strategies. 1. To use one image for the entire slide. 2. To design your own graphics or to combine images. And 3. To use the slide as a grid with sections. The first design strategy is pretty straightforward. You're basically using the entire slide to project your image, like a photo or an illustration. This approach is pretty simple and it helps to create a focal point for the audience, often creating one message. And this is particularly important because you'd want the audience to focus on your talk. This is an example from 2023's UCLA Grad Slam champion, Kelsey Rutledge. On this slide, the speaker has decided to use a single image. This is an image of a skate, which is a relative of a stingray. In their talk, they used the slide to introduce a perhaps familiar-looking sea creature, but one that might not be as well known. So take a couple of seconds to look at this picture and try to see the image for any context of what this could be. So why might this be effective? First, when you use a simple image, it can be very effective in focusing the audience to the message that the image is conveying. In this case, we're all focused on the stingray. The image is also quite compelling. The stingray is swimming in the dark and we see the general shape of this animal. It's also a relatively clear picture, and if we look more closely, you can see the shades of gray that seem like the rocks on the ocean floor. Now, this design strategy can be used for both reference it or ignore it approach, but remember that it depends on the image that you use. So let's take a moment to also think about how this image might not work. First, is it too mysterious? If we don't immediately know what we're looking at, does it distract you? And again, related to this first question, does this image need an explanation? This means using a reference it approach. The second design strategy is to design your own graphics or combine images. This approach allows you to visually represent complex information, such as depicting a process or providing an example to be more easily understood. We're going to look at 3 examples of this strategy. Here's our first example from 2024 finalist Alex Cuoco. Let's walk through this image. So we have 3 background images here covering the entirety of the page. On the left, we have an image of what looks like scores being held up by the crowd. In the middle, an image of a young student on a laptop. And on the right side of the screen, we have a robot that looks like it's thinking with math equations in the background on a chalkboard. Then, on top of these images is a series of icons and directional arrows, suggesting a process of biasing or debiasing of some topic. So based on this image, we are likely to conclude that the image has something to do with student learning or perhaps testing or maybe AI or algorithms. And rightfully so, the title of this presentation was Reducing Bias in Standardized Tests. So why might this be effective? Well, first, the images are simple and crisp. The high resolution makes it easier to grasp what the images are. The main ideas seem to be communicated by the icons in black and white, and the directional arrows show the relationships between these ideas, suggesting to us the topic or main issue. But let's also think about how this might be ineffective. Well, does the combination of images make it too abstract? Does it require too much processing for the audience? And depending on the approach, whether I reference it or ignore it, is it distracting? Here's our second example for designing graphics to describe a process. The angle might be a little challenging, but I wanted to show an action shot so you can see how the graphics might be working or not working when there's a speaker in front of it. Here are 2 images showing process. On the left, it's an example of nutrient cycling. And on the right, the image is titled Wildfire Depositions, and you can see the use of arrows to denote a process. And so let's think about its overall effect. The images are colorful and relatively simple, so we can process the images easily even if we're not experts. But let's also think about the use of phrases and words in this example. The longer chain of words you have, the harder it is for the audience to read and listen to you while you're talking. So if you're going to use this approach and you feel like you need a lot of words, you might want to consider a referenced approach and physically point or turn to the image to read the text that is relevant to your talk. This final design strategy might help you manage the attention of your audience a bit more effectively, especially if you have a combination of images or want to depict a series of related thoughts or points. This strategy uses the slide as a grid with sections. Now, what this allows you to do is to create momentum, but also lets you split the screen or slide into chunks that can encourage better focus. This design will require a referenced approach. Some motivations for doing this might be to explain complex ideas or to visually summarize key project elements. This is an example from 2024's finalist Siddharth Srivastava. As you can see, each portion of the talk corresponds to a section of the slide. Now, considering our reading patterns, we would naturally start from left to right, top to bottom. So we begin with the upper left corner showing us a simple chart, 2 colors and numbers in denominations of 10 so it's easier to understand. Then on the upper right corner showing us an image showing a process with a measurement. And the bottom left corner introduces a specific term, potentially describing a methodology, and then in the bottom right corner we see an image that describes what looks like results. Now, why is this effective? First, using a grid helps to take the audience through the stages and the relevant information is pointed out. However, there is not too much information that the audience might be ahead of the speaker's talk. How the different elements are organized and the use of lines to separate the screen tells us how the information is organized, and it teaches us how to read it. This is particularly helpful when you're using a referenced approach. You'd want to choose a 15 to 30 second window to draw the audience's attention to the slide. Then you'd want to be specific and use language from the slide so you can direct the audience's attention when they're looking at the slide. Here's a quick summary of the 3 design strategies we just discussed. Remember, whichever design strategy you choose, make sure that the visual information you are providing does not distract or detract from comprehending your talk. That concludes our brief webinar on how to finesse your slide for Grad Slam. And if nothing else sticks today because I've subjected you to a long PowerPoint presentation so that you don't remember anything, my one hope is that you remember that when designing a PowerPoint slide, you should aim to balance information with attention. Keep this in mind and your audience will thank you. If you have any questions about the competition, please reach out to the Grad Slam team via askgrad@grad.ucla.edu and put Grad Slam in your subject line. Thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing your presentation at Grad Slam.